welcome everyone. So Mike Soper and I went to Mobile World Congress a few weeks ago, and this webinar is essentially a synopsis of the key takeaways we had from the event, but also things that we've been seeing beyond the event in the telecom ecosystem. So that's the material we're going to be sharing today. So Mike and my contact information are here. If you want to email us, feel free to do so. Before I jump into the content, just so everybody knows, TBR does subscription and custom research. And this is a view of the reports that we put out on a cadence throughout a year. Includes a variety of benchmarks, forecasts, landscapes, and individual company reports. We're covering the telecom ecosystem globally, and we're covering some of the big areas, if you will, in that ecosystem. So specifically 5G, 6G, hyperscaler involvement in telecom, private networks. We have some new reports coming out around telecom AI, and we also have reporting on edge computing and some other hot topics. So for today's agenda, we're going to start off by setting the stage and giving our high-level view of Mobile World Congress. Then we're going to look at the good, the bad, and the ugly. And you'll see why we are framing it this way as we get into the material. And lastly, we'll talk about what we think this means for the telecom ecosystem. So to set the stage for Mobile World Congress, I want to start off with what we heard a lot about. Not surprising, we heard a lot about AI and Gen AI. That was probably the biggest topic at the event. It was not a surprise that that was the case. We also heard quite a bit about network APIs. That's a topic that started at last year's MWC, but we noticed that there was significantly more content and buzz around it at this year's event. We also continued to hear quite a bit about private networks. That market is growing. Our models suggest it's growing at a double-digit rate. And when I say private networks, I'm talking about specifically the private LTE and private 5G market opportunities. We also heard a lot about non-terrestrial networks, also known as NTN. And really, this is satellite connectivity, so direct to device, enterprise use cases for satellite communications, things of that nature. We heard quite a bit about that, as well as we heard a lot about that last year at Mobile World Congress. Cloud transformation, another theme that we've been hearing over the years. More talk about cloud native networks and architecture and how telcos can actually get from point A to point B. Sustainability was also a big topic, especially as it pertained to energy. So silicon advancements, advancements in optical infrastructure, advancements in radio processing, all of those things came back to energy efficiency. And that was the biggest angle that we heard as it pertained to sustainability at the event. I think what's more interesting is what we didn't hear a lot about. And one of the things, surprisingly, that neither Mike nor myself heard a lot about was cellular technology market development and content pertaining specifically to 5G, 5G Advanced, and 6G, and the evolution to 5GA and to 6G. Mike and I were both expecting to hear quite a bit of content around that, and we really didn't. And that was not only surprising, but I think when we sat back and thought about it, I think it's telling of the challenges that the telecom ecosystem is having towards monetizing these investments that they've been making. Where is the ROI from all these investments that the telcos have made over the last few years? And this is, the telcos are hurting. And I think that some of the focus shifted to more of the exciting areas and steered maybe away a bit from some of the areas that are not generating as much excitement. One notable caveat to that would be private networks, where companies, enterprises are basically taking their destinies in their own hands and implementing digital transformation, with private networks being one tool in the toolbox to leverage for driving enterprise digital transformation. Another thing we didn't hear much, if anything, about was metaverse. That's a big contrast to last year's event where everybody was talking about metaverse. We did see some demos for metaverse, AR, VR platforms, things like that. But in the keynote sessions, in the conversations we had with companies, metaverse did not come up. And I thought that was interesting. It also speaks to the fickleness of buzz topics and how they can fall by the wayside. In addition to metaverse, we also noticed that crypto and blockchain had also fallen by the wayside. They're still out there, and I think these are going to be big technologies that are going to, be transformational. But I think that they were ahead of their time in terms of having a big market impact. And I want to draw a contrast with those prior buzz topics to AI. My feel of AI is that this is a little more tangible than some of the topics that the buzz topics we've heard in prior years. The use cases and the business case for AI makes logical sense. And I think that there is significant business outcomes, particularly on the cost reduction side for telco and for vendors. And I think this has staying power. And I think that the AI, we're really going to see innovation here. And we're going to see this be commercially implemented in a way that we haven't seen some of these other hot topics play out. So I want to start off with the good news for the industry that we saw. There were a couple things that we are very positive on for the health of the industry. And then we'll transition to some of the things we're more concerned about. So the good is that AI and Gen AI and FWA present real significant opportunities for CSPs. And it's not just CSPs, it's also the vendors. So from an AI, Gen AI perspective, I'm convinced that there's going to be significant cost reduction at the CSPs over a timeline. Maybe not this year, but if you look over the next 5 to 7 years, especially, I think we're going to see a next evolutionary step in how the operators actually run their businesses and the resourcing that they need to run those businesses when you have AI integrated into business processes and into the operational framework of the network. So that's going to happen over a timeline, but we would expect to see a quick time to realization of an outcome. And the outcome would be ROI in terms of cost reduction. And if we peel back the layers further, there's many use cases that this could implicate all across a CSP. The two domains that we think are going to be the most disrupted initially is going to be call center and what we're calling customer lifecycle management. And customer lifecycle management is really implicating the OSS BSS domain. So think about customer journey and managing of the customer, not just in the call center, but also from a inventory, service assurance, those types of aspects are going to be transformed from AI. And then later on, we do expect the network domain to be disrupted by AI, but I think that one's not as immediate and as the other two domains we've identified. But I do think that the network domain will see over time, AI is going to really disrupt and transform how networks are built, owned, and operated. On the fixed wireless access side, I really want to hammer home this point that this is a this is the only use case for 5G that is scalable and that is driving a positive ROI. This is the only one that we still see when we look at the global landscape. Yes, there's other use cases driving revenue for 5G, but if you look at the other ones, they tend to be smaller scale, more customized, and the ROI is not really there. In some cases, operators are losing significant money trying to get some use cases for 5G off the ground. That is not the case with FWA. And I really want to stress the point that I still think that the industry is underestimating fixed wireless access with 5G. And in terms of the number of households that could be covered with this technology, the scalability of the platform, and also the technological innovations that are coming down in roadmaps that we see are going to dramatically improve the spectral efficiency of running FWA at scale. Think about things like multi-band carrier aggregation. Think about NR unlicensed, NRU. Think about advanced beamforming techniques, massive MIMO. There's a bunch of other technologies that are, some of which are available today, some of which are coming. Another big one is extended range millimeter wave, where you can get, instead of a few hundred meters, you can get much more than that, several times further distance than that, with a good connection, providing performance on par with FTTP, but not requiring the same length of time to actually build that infrastructure in the market. It takes a lot of time to build fiber, to put fiber into a market, especially at the last mile. With FWA, you can bypass a lot of those challenges from a time to market perspective. So there's a lot of innovation that's already available and that's coming. I think that if we look at T-Mobile and Verizon and Reliance Jio and the traction that they have with FWA, I think that those are poster children for what is possible at a much larger scale than what we've seen thus far. And as an industry, I would not be underestimating FWA. Okay, so we have some concerns about the telecom industry. And if anybody's read our predictions documentation, we put out an annual predictions report. And if you've read our subscription reports, you know that this is topics that we've been talking about for a while. And it's an evolution of some of those themes that I really wanted to talk about now. So one thing that we continue to see from the CSPs is what I call tell, not show and tell. So what that means is that the telcos are saying the right things, but they're not showing it. They're not making much progress. And there's key areas where we see this happening. One is 5G SA with a 5G core. Still, relatively few operators are running a 5G SA architecture at scale in their countries. And of that, none of them, I would argue, are running a cloud-native microservices-based core. So they are moving there, but they are moving so slowly that they're not really making much progress in terms of where they need to be from a digital service provider standpoint. This idea of where the service provider of the future will be, we are very far away from that becoming a reality. Network slicing plays into this because you can't do network slicing with a virtual EPC. It's very manual intensive. It's not autonomous. It's not dynamic. Those are the characteristics of network slicing, and those are the big drivers that are bringing interest in network slicing. But if the telcos don't have a 5G core, if they're not running a truly cloud-native microservices-based architecture, how are they going to deliver on network slicing? And how long is it going to take for them to actually be able to support network slicing? This is a big problem. Network APIs also plays into this. From a technology stack perspective, from a cultural perspective at the telcos, from a talent and operation model perspective, institutionalizing and monetizing network APIs is really hard for telcos. We've seen this. They're struggling to get the developer community to pitch in. We're seeing struggles at the traditional CPaaS players, the Twilios, the Vonages. We're seeing challenges there. And we heard some telcos talking a big game about network APIs at MWC, and yeah, they've made some commercialization of specific APIs, but if you look at the big picture and where they need to go in terms of scaling, in terms of building business models around these things, in terms of institutionalizing and changing their ways of working to make network APIs an enablement platform, we're not seeing that. That's concerning. So there's what is being said and there's what there is to show for that. And we're seeing a disconnect. And from my perspective, the most CSPs are not actually transforming into cloud native digital service providers and technology enablers. What they're doing is they're evolving what they know into something more efficient. And that is not going to take them to where they need to go in the digital economy. And playing into that, and why this is very concerning, is because the revenue problem that the industry faces still has no solution on the horizon. I did not see anything on the horizon that has credibility to be commercially deployed at scale that is going to address the revenue problem. The only thing that we see driving significant revenue for telco from the 5G cycle is FWA. Aside from that, we do not see significant traction in these other areas, and that's where the traction really needs to be. If you guys have questions, add them to the Q&A box and we'll take them after. I'm sure there's going to be some questions and debate about some of these topics. We also see, separate from the industry challenges, we see the macroeconomic picture is worsening. And we see that in two ways that I want to focus on here. One is the higher cost of capital. Since the great financial crisis of 2007 to 2009, the central banks of the world reduced interest rates and kept them at artificially low rates for about 15 years at near zero. And even in some countries in Europe, they were negative interest rates. That distorted behavior. It distorted the markets, especially the bond market. And what it did is it enabled operators to restructure their debt obligations and take out much, much more debt than they had before the GFC. And that's exactly what most telcos did. Not all of them, but many of them, well over half of the telcos in the ecosystem globally have much greater debt burdens than they did pre-GFC. And that was okay under an artificially low interest rate environment. But what's happening now, since COVID, is we have inflation and we have central banks that are under pressure to address the inflation. And in order to do that, they need to increase interest rates. I'm sure everybody on this call notices in some way interest rates are going up for car loans, for mortgage loans, personal loans, credit card loans. All of those are manifestations of higher interest rates in the general economy. Corporates are also facing higher interest rates. And when telcos need to refinance the debt or take out new debt, that's a problem. How are they going to make new investments to address the shortfalls that they have in these critical areas, these critical technology enablement areas, if they have to pay much higher interest rates on the debt? This is a big problem. So this is a recipe for a major problem. Something is going to have to give. And this is the title of our Mobile World Congress special report, which is what this webinar is based off of. That's why we entitled it, "The Telecom Industry is Facing a Reckoning," because something's going to have to give here. This is not sustainable. And we've reached a point in the industry where something is going to have to give. So where does this go? Where do we think this is going to go? So we think that the telecom industry is going to look very different over the next decade. We are expecting a new wave of rationalization. And when I say rationalization, I mean that there's going to be more M&A, bankruptcies, and major restructurings. AI is going to drive some of those restructurings. You're going to see AI incorporated in telcos as part of these restructuring initiatives, but it's much broader than that. This is a structural problem in the industry where they need to shift from what they've done for decades or even a century, essentially, their core business model of selling access. That may change as we continue on in this digital era and this digital economy is built out. We're expecting fewer but larger and stronger CSPs and vendors. And I want to give you some immediate examples of this. This is happening now. I'm going to give you 3 examples of this. One is in Canada, where Rogers relatively recently completed its acquisition of the number 4 largest player, Shaw Communications. And pre-COVID, I don't think that deal would have happened. But now it happened. Yes, there's concessions, but that deal happened. In the UK, we have Vodafone and 3UK merging. That got green lighted. Yeah, there's some concessions, but I doubt regulators would have allowed that deal pre-COVID. And the third example I'd like to give is in Spain, where recently the Orange and Mass Mobile deal is going to be green lighted by regulators. That too, I have doubts that would have been allowed by regulators pre-COVID. So we're seeing a change in the regulatory stance towards M&A. We're seeing larger telcos combining now, whereas before that might not have happened. In some countries, to give you guys an idea of the magnitude of these combinations, if you think back 10 or so years ago when AT&T attempted to buy T-Mobile, for those of you who may remember that, in some of these countries, from a relative magnitude standpoint, that's basically the size of an M&A deal that we're looking at here. Where at the time, T-Mobile was the 4th largest provider and Sprint was the 3rd largest provider. I'm going back in time here. But the regulators did not let that deal go through. Now we're seeing regulators in different countries allowing this to happen. And even in some countries, we're starting to hear that 2 operators might be the norm. In countries like India, where you have companies like Vodafone Idea that is hanging on, and they're one step away from filing for bankruptcy. They've said this publicly. This is not, they've said this. Dish Network has also recently said that they're a going concern. They do not have enough money to meet their debt obligations in November. They've said this publicly now. So you can see the framing from a landscape perspective that there is rationalization happening at a level that I would argue we have not seen in this industry before. The implementation of cost reduction solutions, we're also going to see change management and deep restructuring. So part of the thing that'll keep telcos moving is they're going to be able to protect EPS and maybe even show a little bit of growth in a weak revenue environment from economies of scale, from more combinations, as well as from driving OPEX reduction. So that's going to help them protect earnings per share in a challenged, broader environment. The other thing we're expecting to see, and I would argue we're already seeing glimmers of this, is that new market opportunities are going to go to other players. So network slicing, network APIs, programmable networks, edge computing, private networks. These are just some examples of areas where we're seeing or could see disintermediation of the telco from the value chain. And I'll give you one example of this for right now is in the area of private networks. And we are seeing more and more enterprises going around telcos direct to the enterprise, or they're getting basically getting fed the transformation from their CNSI partners. But in many cases, we're not seeing any telco in the value chain, not even for spectrum, depending on the country, if there's private spectrum available. In places like Germany, we're seeing disintermediation of the telco from the value chain. Another example I'd like to give is in the area of edge computing. Now, if we go back in time, the telcos tried to do cloud services. They tried to compete against the hyperscalers, and we know what happened in history. Why would edge computing be any different than central cloud? I don't think it's going to be very different. And that would be another example where a major growth opportunity, a major enabler of innovation is going to go to other players where the telco could be disintermediated completely, or the scope of what their involvement is in that market opportunity is very narrow. And I think, so basically what I'm saying is there's historical precedent for what we're saying here. And what we're saying is that those glimmers, those historical references are going to get bigger in magnitude, and they're going to broaden out across other key areas where the industry is going to generate value. Business model disruption plays into this new market opportunity scope because, as I said before, operators are very good at what they've done for decades, selling access, selling, now they're selling data. They used to be selling minutes and text messages. Now they're selling data. In some countries, it's unlimited data, all you can eat data. What's the next step? Where does that business model go? Where does that take the telcos? There may be fundamental disruption of that business model that the telcos know so well in the not too distant future. And the regulatory environment is not helping telcos. We heard a lot of talk about the regulatory environment at MWC. We usually do. But the way that the operators are talking about it, it's an existential problem. And essentially the regulatory framework, especially in places like Europe, where it's especially restrictive, if fundamental changes aren't made there in the short term, we could see dire situations for telcos emerging where they're not able to fund their businesses. They may need to be bailed out. There may need to be government brokered combinations, partial or full nationalizations. I mean, this is heavy stuff. And that's really at the point the industry's at if some of these structural problems are not addressed. So the reason why Europe is a unique case is because countries, if you think about Europe as a bunch of countries together, the countries are the sizes, roughly speaking, of US states. And in the US, you have some level of combination at the federal level for regulation. But in Europe, you have subscale telcos. In some cases, there's many of them in an individual country running at a fraction of the scale that tier ones would be running in much larger population countries. And there's also, in some cases, regulatory frameworks on a country level that restrict operators from doing, from scaling. And it restricts their ability to compete at the same level that operators can in other countries. So that's one reason, just one of many reasons why operators in Europe are at an especially challenged situation, and these things will have to be dealt with. If we look at history as a reference, when you have situations where an industry needs a structural change in the regulatory framework, Usually that's precipitated by a economic crisis. And I'll give you guys two examples of this if we go back in history and look. So the first example would be the Great Depression of the 1930s. And if you look at what happened there, we had government become big in the economy and orchestrate a new deal essentially between companies and the labor dynamic. And we saw regulatory frameworks put in place that were fundamentally different, things never seen or conceived before the Great Depression that came into effect. Many of those programs still continue on to this day, like Social Security and things of that nature. My point is that big changes in the economic picture drive policy, fundamental changes in policy. A more recent example of this would be the Great Financial Crisis and the structural changes that were made in the financial services industry as a result of that, where policies, frameworks were re-looked at and evolved essentially to be more modernized and to put protections in place where the cause of that crisis could not happen again, or would be a much lower probability of it happening again. So the point I want to leave people with here is that in order to get the fundamental structural changes that is being asked for by the industry from regulators, to move regulators to action, it's going to require a crisis. Okay, so what does this mean for vendors? So we're expecting the CapEx environment to remain subdued. We've already seen CapEx come down last year. It's going to be down again this year. 2025, we're not sure yet. It might be flat at a lower level. It might go up a tiny bit, but it's going to be subdued. That's why we're using that term subdued. It's going to be at a lower level than it has been over the last 5 years. And one of the key reasons for this is we're seeing operators entering what we call cash flow management mode. If you guys want to read more about this, take a look at our predictions webinar. We give examples of companies and what they're doing, what that means in terms of their behavioral changes in line with this strategy shift, this pivot of focus, if you will. CapEx is one of the biggest areas where operators can move the needle in their operating cash flow and their free cash flow, and it's being leveraged as a tool to improve their balance sheet and to improve their working capital. 5G Advanced, we're expecting the spend cycle to be underwhelming. In Mobile World Congress 2023, we heard optimism from vendors that 5G-A would drive an echo boom in CapEx spend. This year, I noticed the tone was much more subdued. And based on our own analysis, separate from conversations we've had, is that that's in line with what we're expecting, where it's going to be a relatively subdued, very shallow impact on aggregate CapEx. The pace of the shift to cloud and 5G SA has been slow, relatively slow. We're expecting it to remain slow. Some network domains, as an example, the operators are very hesitant to move it to the cloud, and they're unlikely to do it. Specifically, the 5G core. Any incumbent operator is highly unlikely to move that into the public cloud. Highly unlikely. Where we do see it happening is with greenfield operators like Dish, but they're a one-off case. They're an exception to the rule. And there's other domains as well that are also going to move very, very slowly into the cloud. Think about things like RAN. Open Virtual RAN is moving very, very slowly from an architectural evolution standpoint. We don't see any catalysts that are going to move that faster. If anything, technological complexity and the cost associated with these technologies, these architectures, may be a deterrent, may actually slow down the pace with which companies move to that next phase. We do expect more CapEx to be allocated to FWA. So I mentioned before, there's an underestimation of the opportunity, and there is revenue being generated here. There is positive ROI. So this is going to be an area of focus for more and more operators globally. It has been, but I think the scope is going to broaden as we move through this year and next year especially. We're going to see more operators talking about FWA. We're going to see broader investment programs to lean into that opportunity. So this is actually one area that is a positive note for the vendor community. We are expecting more telcos to struggle to pay their bills. So some of the things we've seen, payment terms have been extended. They're likely to be extended further. Vendor financing is likely to feature more prominently in new deals. Some companies like AT&T are prolific users of vendor financing. Many billions of dollars they finance through their vendors. We're expecting many, many more billions for them to do going forward. And we're expecting more operators to do similar things, maybe to get more favorable interest rates, to get more favorable payment terms. We're going to see more of this. That's a definite trend. We're going to see more telcos shift focus. So specifically, a pivot in mindset from CapEx investment to retraction, debt pay down is going to be a big focus for telcos, and making sure that interest burden, when debt comes up for maturity, instead of rolling it into new debt that maybe is 2 or 3 times higher in interest rate, they may instead decide to pay it off using cash flow freed up from lower CapEx. So situations like that we're expecting to see at a much higher frequency. And then M&A and asset monetization remaining top of mind. More M&A, horizontal M&A especially, enables economies of scale. This enables operators to offset some of the headwinds that they're facing as an industry and protect earnings per share, and maybe even provide some accretion to earnings per share. At the end of the day, these companies are beholden to the shareholders. So that's always investment decisions are always going to come back to how does this impact capital allocation and share prices, et cetera. Okay, so that was the presentation, and now we'll open up for Q&A. And I see there is a bunch of questions in the queue. We'll take each question until we run out of time. So, and my colleague, Mike Soper, is here as well to address questions. So if you hear him chime in, that's who you're hearing. So the first question is, do CSPs expect private cellular networks to contribute to their 5G ROI? Uptake seems to be very slow. So from a telco perspective, uptake is relatively slow for private networks. But if you look from a vendor perspective, for example, if you look at a Nokia, if you look at what they're making in revenue from from private networks, they're growing at a double-digit rate. They're growing strongly, and they have been. And there's other vendors as well that are growing at a very strong rate, like a Huawei, maybe even Ericsson to an extent. If you look at those players, if you go direct to the source of the infrastructure, the source of the application layer, the source of the services provided to implement, manage, support those environments, those players are performing much, much better than how the telcos are. And that's an example, an indicator, if you will, of this disintermediation of the value chain that we see occurring for telcos. So saying that differently, just to be a little more succinct, the vendors, the non-telco providers in the private network value chain are outperforming where the operators are. And therefore, if you look at it from a holistic standpoint, there actually is quite a bit of traction in the private networks market. Mike, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I think for the CSPs, the way we're seeing them, potentially make revenue from private networks is from spectrum leasing, for one, and then those CSPs that have a strong systems integration organization, they're able to partake in the value chain as well. They're providing kind of a channel for some of the infrastructure players to go to market, and then providing some of the services on top of that. But by and large, they've been disintermediated from this opportunity.
Now, some of the telcos are doing resell. A lot of what they're doing in private networks is resell, and they do provide some value-added services on top of the deal. So, for example, there may be deployment, design, systems integration work at the network infrastructure layer, managed services. We do see some more sophisticated operators providing those types of services, but you have to look at magnitude and the broader market opportunity. So those are the comments that Mike and I are making when we talk about the way that we're describing how that market's playing out. Okay, the next question is, what impact does the highly regulated nature of telecom have on established operators moving towards more forward-looking technologies like cloud-native, 5G SA, and network API? So yes, the highly regulated nature is restrictive to operators making those shifts, and this is one of many reasons why the operators are moving very, very slowly in making progress in these areas. There is a high risk that players, non-telco players, will wind up going over the top or going around the operators with new market opportunities stemming from those technologies. And specifically, I'm thinking of companies like the hyperscalers. Those are the types of companies where you could see real disruption of the status quo in the telecom industry. The next question is, Mike, did you want to add anything to that?
No, that's good.
Okay. The next question is, where are CSPs making their money from? Are they just milking their current infrastructure cow? So I think there's a lot of that for sure, on the legacy side, as well as the more of the newer network side. So when I say newer, I mean LTE, 5G connections, more advanced IoT connections, things of that nature for sure. The vast, so we actually have some reports that do revenue breakdowns of the B2B revenue that operators generate, B2B, and we have consumer separate out from that. If you look at the breakdown of where their revenues are coming from, it's access, it's reselling other vendors' products. Those are the primary areas where they generate the vast majority of their money. So, and when I say access, I'm talking about mobile broadband, I'm talking about fixed broadband, I'm talking about fixed voice, which there's still quite a bit of that out there. Those are the types of areas where the vast majority of operators continue to make their money from today. Do you have anything, Mike, for that?
Yeah, for the most part, they are just milking their current infrastructure cow. There's little areas where they are able to add new revenue streams. I know we talked about edge computing a little bit earlier, so site leasing, things like that. But by and large, they're still just providing the access, reselling, devices. They're trying to increase their connections. So whether it's IoT sensors, whether it's wearables for consumers, that's how they're making their new money.
Okay, the next question is, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on smartphone revenue growth and ARPUs for MNOs, especially in enterprise. So especially during COVID, the COVID years, we did see an uptick in multi-line users where they have a personal and a business phone. So we did see quite a bit of that flow through in the market, especially in the US market. We saw a lot of that. But that is post-peak now. A lot of that is already passed through the market. And actually, you can see that now in device revenues for the operators. I'm mostly talking about the US right now, but we have seen similar things in other countries. So the smartphone opportunity is mature, and I would say if you look at the primary markets, the developed markets, it's post-peak opportunity. It's really about what's the next big thing from a connected device standpoint. And I would argue that the next big thing will ultimately be wearables, and that's a big category. But specifically, I think we're going to see headsets, AR devices become big. Apple is starting that trend where it's very early stages. But if you look at some of the technologies coming out from Apple and Meta and a few other companies, I think you can see how that use case or that device domain, rather, will be the next big thing from a connected device standpoint. Okay, do you have anything to add, Mike? All right, so the next question is, how do you see CapEx reductions affecting non-RAN areas, specifically core and security analytics applications? So we mentioned before that the move to true cloud native microservices-based architecture for the 5G core, I would argue that no operators are actually doing that today. And the key word is microservices. So when operators say they have cloud native, mostly what they're saying is either it's running on virtual machines or it's running containers. But in many cases, they're not running CI/CD pipelines. They're not running it in microservices. They're not running it in some of the principles, the characteristics that a hyperscaler would define as true cloud native. And that's the big disconnect there on the core side. And that is the complexity of that transition is expensive, and there's a lot of unknowns there. And we also talked before about the regulatory restrictions, constrictions that these operators have to moving forward. Things like how is data privacy managed and things of that nature. Making sure that there's remaining in compliance there as some of those core functions may go into a cloud native state. Those are things to think about. So I think core spend will increase even if the RAN environment is subdued. But the pace, the magnitude of the increase, I think, is going to be underwhelming. And it's going to be a much longer, more drawn out cycle than I think some of the vendors think it will be. And on the security side, I think it's similar. We also have security evolution occurring in the hyperscalers where you're abstracting yourself from the network and you're providing full perimeter security using new security protocols and architectures, things like SASE, for example, to address the evolution of network security. I would argue that we're seeing innovation running beyond the scope of telco. And that's where we really see a lot of the growth occurring in the broader cybersecurity domain. Mike, do you have anything to add to that? Okay, so we have some more questions coming in. We'll get through as many as we can. We are going to end at the top of the hour. So the next question is, EU operators are pressuring regulators and politicians to create a sort of tax or fee on hyperscalers and other over-the-top providers. How do you see this? So this was a topic at MWC24. I actually wrote some about this. And we actually do write about this in some of our reports. My take on that is be careful what you wish for. If the regulators impose fees on the hyperscalers and other over-the-top providers, that would heavily incentivize a behavioral change among those players where it may make sense for them to, instead of using the telcos, to build their own pipes. And I would argue that the hyperscalers have already built significant pipe infrastructure interconnecting their data centers as well as in the access layer of the network. And I'll give you a few examples of this to make it real. The hyperscalers, if you look at capacity running over hyperscalers networks, the bulk of the traffic now runs over hyperscaler-owned infrastructure. So long haul, terrestrial and submarine optical infrastructure, as well as metro optical infrastructure interconnecting cities. In many cases, the hyperscalers actually made the investment in that infrastructure. The telco has been disintermediated from a lot of those opportunities. If we look at CDNs and go back in time 10, 15 years ago, telcos and the Akamais and Limelights of the world were big players in that domain. They still are relatively big players, but the hyperscalers they have superseded them in terms of the amount of traffic running over a hyperscaler CDN infrastructure that the hyperscalers bought and implemented versus the traditional CDN players. If you look at the magnitude of traffic running over those two different ownership structures, it has dramatically shifted over to hyperscale. So we could see similar things happen in the mobile core. We could see similar things happen in direct-to-device from satellite connectivity. We could see similar things happen in unlicensed spectrum running on Wi-Fi protocols or Bluetooth protocols, even in cellular protocols. So the fee is up for a lot of debate, has been debated quite a bit, but I think there may be unintended consequences of what the operators are asking for and how that might change behavior of the hyperscalers and other over-the-top providers.
One thing I noticed, I think at MWC24 compared to the press that came out of last year, 2023, there was much less talk of the hyperscalers having to pay a fee for usage of the telco access networks. I do think that died down a little bit over the course of the year.
Okay, the next question is, AT&T has gone through a period of retrenchment, shedding non-core businesses to train its focus almost exclusively on fixed and mobile broadband. That appears to be a recipe for slow or no growth. What's your take? So yes, that's very much in line with the comments we've made that the operators are focusing on what they know, what they do. They're trying to do it more efficiently. So specifically selling the access to the pipe, how do we do that more efficiently? And you're right, that is a recipe for slow and no growth. And that's exactly what we're seeing, not just at AT&T that you mentioned there, but at a broad industry level across countries. That's what we're seeing at an industry level. Where I think things get interesting, especially from an AT&T standpoint, is they have a pretty transformational deal with Microsoft, where Microsoft is basically transforming AT&T's core and there's an opportunity for innovation to come there through AT&T, where Microsoft is basically moving through AT&T to bring innovation into the telecom ecosystem in areas like network APIs and network slicing potentially, and areas like that. I think that's the longer term vision. But in that case, the telco is essentially handed the keys of the castle to a hyperscaler. So it is in line with the comments I've made that we are seeing disintermediation in the value chain of the telco in some of these key technology enablement areas that are supposed to drive the next phase of growth for the telecom industry.